2. Cicero and the Rule of Reason. At a later date, Cicero expressed this quite frankly. So, in the very beginning, we must persuade our citizens that the gods are the lords and rulers of all things, and that what is done by their will and authority, that they are likewise great benefactors of man, observing the character of every individual, what he does, of what wrong he is guilty, and with what intentions and with what piety he fulfills his religious duties, and that they take notes of the pious and the impious. For surely minds which are imbued with such ideas will not fail to form true and useful opinions. This, of course, represented a self-conscious use of religion which, while in the Roman tradition, lacked the integrity of the earlier position. Grimmel is correct in speaking of Roman morality of the early period, that its distinct aim was the subordination of the individual to the city. This was true also of Roman religion. The meaning of the word pietas, descriptive of the religious man, is revealing. A man was pious if he recognized, admitted, and moved in terms of his subordination and obligation to God, man, family, and the state. He discharged his duty where duty was due because of sacred relationships. The framework for the religious and familial acts of piety was Rome itself, the central and most sacred community. Rome strictly controlled all rights of corporation, assembly, religious meetings, clubs, and street gatherings, and it brooked no possible rival to its centrality. One of the reasons for the later supremacy of the military bodies over Rome was the lack of any organized bodies within the state to provide a counterbalance to the two swollen bodies which became the rulers of the empire, the army, and the abiding and growing civil service. The state alone could organize, short of conspiracy, the citizens could not. On this ground alone, the highly organized Christian church was an offense and an affront to the state, and an illegal organization readily suspected of conspiracy. Pietas meant the observation of ritual and relationship between beings anywhere in the universe. Pietas is first and foremost a kind of justice on the immaterial plane, maintaining spiritual things in their due place. A related verb is piare, which refers to the act of wiping out a stain, an evil omen, a crime. A man who violates the order of things, like a son striking his father, is a monstrum, a prodigy contrary to the order of nature. Closely related to this concept of piety was the idea of genius, a divinity symbolizing the spirit, the religious principle inherent in a being or place, even in a college. Basic to this belief was the concept of continuity and the immanent divinity in all being. The worship of the emperor's genius was one of the many elements which led up to Caesar worship. From 195 BC on, the Dea Roma cult, begun in Smyrna, grew into a new and potent abstraction, the idea of the Roman people and their city as a divine personality. This idea was not foreign to Rome in its developed concept of the God King, as may be seen in the old legend of the apotheosis of Romulus into the divine figure of Quirinius. The discrediting of kingship in early Rome led to a dislike of the idea of a God King, but not to a rejection of its religious foundations. Power, wherever and however manifested, whether for good or for evil, was an indication of the presence of immanent divinity. Hence, diseases were raised in times of plague to the ranks of deity, temples built to them and sacrifices made, as febris, fever, mephitis, cloacina, and verminous, wormy during a plague amongst cattle. The growth of the cult of Rome and the rise of a cult of the God King, whenever a strong ruler appeared, were thus inevitable and logical outgrowths of the Roman faith. The conflict of Christianity with Rome was thus political from the Roman perspective, although religious from the Christian perspective. The Christians were never asked to worship Rome's pagan gods. They were merely asked to recognize the religious primacy of the state. As Francis Legge observed, the officials of the Roman Empire in time of persecution sought to force the Christians to sacrifice not to any heathen gods, but to the genius of the emperor and the fortune of the city of Rome, and at all times the Christians' refusal was looked upon not as religious, but as a political offence. Whatever rivalry the Christian Church had to face in its infancy, it had none to fear from the deities of Olympus. The issue then was this: should the emperor's law, state law, govern both the state and the church, or were both states and church, emperor and bishop alike, under God's law? Who represented true and ultimate order, God or Rome, eternity or time? The Roman answer was Rome and time, and hence Christianity constituted a treasonable faith and a menace to political order. The Roman answer to the problem of man was political, not religious. This meant, first, that man's basic problem was not sin, but lack of political order. This Rome sought to supply, religiously and earnestly. Second, Rome answered the problem of the one and the many in favour of oneness, the unity of all things in terms of the state. Rome, hence over-organisation, undue simplification and centralisation, increasingly characterised Rome. Although he sees it as a yearning for their simple past, William Carroll Bark cites as one of the causes of Rome's failure the fact that they confuse simplicity with strength, as if one could not exist without the other. However real the differences of Rome from other ancient cultures, it still subscribed to the basic myth and dialectic of chaos and order, and the Republic was firmly committed to the primacy of order. The necessity of and the revitalizing powers inherent in chaos were recognized, and hence the festival, the Saturnalia, with its controlled, limited, and ostensibly revivifying chaos. When order was in crisis and endangered, the amount of chaos permitted was increased. Thus, cults such as the Bacchanalia were permitted in Rome as a consequence of the devastating challenge to the Roman order by Hannibal. In the court case brought about by A. Boetius, it was held that almost half the population was involved in the Bacchanalia, which required total defilement as a condition of entrance, the systematic violation of all moral laws as their law. The holiest article of their faith was to think nothing a crime. The cult was not only involved in sexual perversions, but also, like all such cults then and now, aimed at political power and control, and was involved in murder, falsifying evidence, and forging signatures and wills. The senatorial decree of 186 BC abolished the Bacchanalia from Italy except for minor local cults. Julius Caesar may have reintroduced it. It reappeared certainly in connection with other foreign cults of chaos in the days of the emperors. Although the Roman festivals were often expressions of the chaos faith, they were so thoroughly controlled by order, the Roman state, that chaos had to use foreign forms rather than the historic Roman myths when it gained its ascendancy. Hence the extensive presence of Oriental cults in the empire. The Romans tended to identify chaos with the body and its appetites, and reason with order. The roots of Western asceticism are extensively bound up in this dialectic rather than biblical Christianity, which is hostile to asceticism. To submit to the pleasures of the flesh, however enticing, was to submit to chaos and to dethrone order. The older Romans were thus distrustful of sex. Of Marcus Cato, Plutarch wrote, Manilius also, who according to the public expectation would have been next consul, he threw out of the Senate, because, in the presence of his daughter and in open day, he had kissed his wife. He said that, as for himself, his wife never came into his arms except when there was a great thunder, so that it was for jest with him, that it was a pleasure for him when Jupiter thundered. When Cato and other Romans like him kissed their wives without thunder, it was for the purpose of detection, so that, if they had been drinking, the odour might betray them. The women fought back at this by drinking spiced wine, in which the smell of spices would be stronger than the smell of alcohol. While Cato may have been more rigorous than most, he was definitely in the Roman tradition, regarded as old-fashioned in his day, but truly Roman. Marcus Tullius Cicero, 106 to 43 BC, was in the same tradition, a Roman conservative, that is, a champion of reason against chaos. For him, the equation was a simple one. Knowledge meant order, and error meant disorder. For Cicero, order meant law, and law meant reason. True law is right reason in agreement with nature. It is of universal application, unchanging and everlasting. It summons to duty by its commands and averts from wrongdoing by its prohibitions. Law is the highest reason implanted in nature. This reason, when firmly fixed and fully developed in the human mind, is law. Law is intelligence. The origin of justice is to be found in law, for law is a natural force. For Cicero, nature was not fallen but normative, and hence the source of justice. The world of nature, the cosmos or order of being, includes both God or gods and men, and they share in a common reason. Therefore, since there is nothing better than reason, and since it exists both in man and God, the first common possession of man and God is reason. But those who have reason in common must also have right reason in common. And since right reason is law, we must believe that men have law also in common with the gods. This order, which is basic to both divine society and human society, makes them one world. Hence, we must now conceive of this whole universe as one commonwealth of which both gods and men are members. This law, or order, is given and ultimate. Law is not a product of human thoughts, nor is it any enactment of peoples, but something eternal which rules the whole universe by its wisdom in command and prohibition. Thus, they have been accustomed to say that law is the primal and ultimate mind of God. Although men had been accustomed to say God, Cicero was basically committed to saying law or reason. In Scipio's dream, Cicero wrote, "Know then that you are a god, if a god is that which lives, feels, remembers and foresees, and which rules, governs the body over which it is set. An immortal spirit moves the frail body." If Cicero was a god, then why not Caesar? In the spring of 54 BC, Cicero indeed wrote to Julius Caesar in Gaul, "You will see from this letter how convinced I am that you are a second self to me." The gods gave an especially high place to the saviors of state. All men who have saved or benefited their native land or have enhanced its power are assigned in a special place in heaven where they may enjoy a life of eternal bliss. For the supreme God who rules the entire universe finds nothing, at least among earthly objects, more pleasing than the societies and groups of men, united by law and right, which are called states. The rulers and saviors of states set forth from that place, and to that place return. The true order pleasing to whatever gods may be, is thus the state. This means that time, history, is the central and determinative arena of being, and the state is the locale of its meaning as it becomes incarnate. There is no eternal decree emanating from God to make eternity determinative of time. The gods and men are both subject to chance, and it is not in the power even of God himself to know what event is going to happen accidentally and by chance. Cicero was ready to accept divination as a religious exercise of state, as a necessity in keeping the populace religiously respectful of authority, but in practice he disbelieved it utterly. When he wrote the Republic, Cicero favoured maintaining the rights of augury and of auspices because of their historical part in Rome. Because of his belief in obedience to law, and because, as a member of the aristocratic party, he thought augury and auspices the best means of controlling the excesses of democracy. The area of determination and destiny was time and history, and more specifically, the state. And in answer to the question, what is a state? Cicero made it clear that a true state is reason, and the law and order which flow from reason. Accordingly, he could say of his exile in 58 BC during the Claudian upheaval, I was not exiled from the states which did not exist, because it had forsaken reason. Cicero's answer to the question, what is freedom, was this: the power to live as you will. But the only man who truly lives as he wills is the one who follows the things that are right. Thus, if the state be ruled by reason or by philosopher rulers, then, however totalitarian its law, its citizens are for Cicero free men. The issue between the aristocrats and the People's Party, led also by aristocrats like Caesar, was not liberty, but power. For the aristocrats, at their best, as in Cicero, freedom was the rule of reason as represented in the old order. For the Democrats, freedom was a triumph of force, power, of planned overturning or chaos. Cicero had been ready to grant extraordinary powers to Pompey, involving possible innovations to preserve order. His readiness briefly to see some good in Julius Caesar was grounded in the hope that Caesar would champion rational order. Dickinson maintained that Caesar represented instrumentalism and Cicero constitutionalism. The distinction is a thoughtful and a valid one if we avoid reading the modern connotations into instrumentalism and especially constitutionalism. Constitutionalism for Cicero meant reason, and instrumentalism for Caesar meant the creative force of sheer power. Power could crush, forgive, and regenerate. Power, not reason, was the lifeblood of the state for Caesar, who saw the conservative senators as unrealistic fools. Both parties were moving towards a showdown and towards an incarnation of their faith. Cicero earnestly saw his standard of reason as the hope, and himself as representative of reason, and looked back fondly to the time when he had been hailed Saviour of the country. Later, he was to hail Octavian hopefully as this heaven-sent young man. Cicero spoke of knowledge as more exalted than God, and hence he could call the learned Plato the god of philosophers. Everything in his thinking called for an incarnation of reason as head of state, but the times created instead an incarnation of power as head of state. And in this Cicero had a hand, as did others before him, as he stripped religion from reason and left no moral obstacle to the democratic demands for chaos. The controlled use of chaos in festivals Cicero recognized as a valid part of Roman life. Interestingly, he defended Gnaeus Plancius before a jury in 54 BC, declaring, "You say that he raped a ballet girl. We hear that this crime was once committed, at Atina by a band of youths who took advantage of an old privilege allowed at the scenic games, especially in country towns. What a tribute to the propriety of my client's youthful days. He is reproached with an act which he was permitted by privilege to commit, and yet even that reproach is found to be baseless. But now, the rape of the Roman Republic was in process, violence becoming a means to omnipotence. Cicero, as we have seen, held that reason, law, is a natural force, a very real power, and the true means to omnipotence and true order should be reason. But even as a body could be ruled by sensuality and its chaos rather than by reason, so could the body politic. The wise man, and Cicero believed himself to be wise, controlled his sensuality by reason, governing the power of chaos by the power of divine intellect. He regarded sensual indulgences not as sins, but as surrenders to chaos, as abandonments of the true order of reason. Sex was thus to be distrusted and used with care under the control of reason. Chaos, vice, when set in motion, could not be stopped. He therefore who looks for a limit to vice is doing much the same as if he were to think that a man who has flung himself headlong from Lucus can stop his fall when he will. And thus, in spite of all his persistence in hoping and trying to re-establish the Republic, he feared Rome was done. After the murder of Caesar in 44 BC, when a friend, more respectful of Caesar than Cicero, said, "There is no way out of the mess," Cicero was inclined to agree. 6 or 7 weeks later, he observed, "I was a fool. I now see, to be consoled by the Ides of March. The fact is, we showed the courage of men, the prudence of children." He persisted in trying and was in the end beheaded, one of his executioners being a man whom Cicero had defended in court against the charge of murdering his own father. Cicero, as a champion of the order of reason, feared sex religiously, not as a sin, but as a revolt against reason whose overindulgence meant overturning order. The atheistic philosopher-poet Lucretius shared the same horror of sex. Sexual passion was a chaotic and destroying power from his perspective. Yet fly such phantoms from the foot of love, abstain libidinous to worthier themes. Turn thy spirit, let the race at large thy liberal heart divide, nor lavish gross. Over one fond object thy exhausted strength, gendering long cares and certain grief at last. For love's deep ulcer fed grows deeper still, rank and more poisonous, and each coming day augments the madness. The fearful and chaotic power of sex spelled for Lucretius both devastation and slavery. Then, too, his form consumes the toils of love, wastes all his vigour, and his days roll on in vilest bondage. He counselled as one means of escape the studied contemplation of all the woman's physical defects and the frailties of flesh, lest her humid kisses mislead him. Every hour man should remember the defects of the woman, lest he be in the silly nets led captive, and become as shameless as the dogs which copulate in the streets. Cicero, too, feared sensuality and counselled his son against it, advising training in toil and endurance, of both mind and body, so as to be strong for active duty in military and civil service. The service of the state was thus paramount for Cicero. Sensuality destroyed reason and hence virtue. For sensual pleasure, a most seductive mistress, turns the hearts of the greater part of humanity away from virtue, and when the fiery trial of affliction draws near, most people are terrified beyond measure. Not even in retirement, said Cicero, did I surrender myself to a life of sensual pleasure unbecoming to a philosopher. Like Sophocles, he felt that a great advantage of old age was deliverance from sex. We come now to the third ground for abusing old age, and that is, that it is devoid of sensual pleasures. Oh, glorious boon of age, if it does indeed free us from youth's most vicious fault!